February 20th, 1943, north of Kasserine Pass, Tunisia. The air was dry and electric, thick with the metallic taste of sand and oil. I, Lieutenant Hans Weber, commander of a Panzer IV in the Africa Corps, stood inside my turret, listening to the steady rattle of the Maybach engine beneath me. The desert shimmered under the early sun, and somewhere beyond the ridge, American armor was moving. In my headset, the radio crackled, the familiar rasp of static that had become the background noise of our war. "Weber, advance with 2nd Platoon." My company commander's voice broke apart, swallowed by interference. Then silence. I adjusted the frequency again, tapping the FuG-5's metal casing with the side of my glove, knowing it would make no difference. Our transmitter, 10 watts of amplitude modulation operating somewhere between 27 and 33 megahertz, was supposed to reach 2 or 3 kilometers when stationary. But in motion, with engines roaring and spark plugs firing, the signal barely carried a few hundred meters. The others could hear me, perhaps, but I could not hear them. In this desert, radio silence wasn't a tactic. It was our condition of existence. Dust rose ahead. Through the periscope, I saw movement. 5 Sherman tanks emerging one after another, their silhouettes distorted by heat and distance. They were separated by gullies and rocks, no line of sight between them. Yet they moved as if tethered by invisible wires. No flags, no flares, no riders darting between them. Each tank shifted precisely to cover the blind spot of the others, like limbs of a single creature feeling its way forward. My gunner whispered, "How are they doing that?" I didn't answer. I was too busy trying to raise headquarters, turning the tuning dial until the noise turned from static to nothing at all. When we engaged, the fight was brief and confusing. Shells fell around us, and I tried once more to report our position. But the only reply was the hollow hiss of the FuG-5. I had never felt so alone inside a machine surrounded by men. The Shermans closed in, their formation adjusting in ways that made no sense. They reacted before we fired, repositioned before we even appeared in their sights. It wasn't instinct, it was communication. I remember shouting into the microphone, "Signal check! Platoon leader, respond." But all I received was silence and the faint crackle of electricity. In those moments, I realized something unsettling. We had believed our technology to be unmatched, our training flawless, our doctrine superior. But those American tanks, those clumsy high-profile machines we mocked, were fighting as one, guided by voices we couldn't hear. I watched them weave through the dust with unnatural precision, and a cold thought struck me. They were not guessing where each other was. They knew. When the last of their shells forced us to withdraw behind the ridge, I sat back in my seat, headset still on, listening to the endless static. For the first time in this war, I felt that our greatest enemy was not the tank I could see, but the silence I could not escape. After the battle, the desert fell silent, except for the faint clicking of cooling metal. In the maintenance tent that night, I overheard the communications unit arguing over intercepted American transmissions. One of the signal operators, his headset still around his neck, said in disbelief, "Their voices come through like they're standing right next to me. No static, no distortion." The others laughed nervously, suggesting it must have been luck, or a strong wind carrying the sound. But I had heard it too during the fight. A clarity so unnatural, it made me think our equipment was broken. Later, as I sat by the dim light of a lantern, I wrote in my notebook, "It isn't tactics. It's something invisible in the air." We had been trained to believe in precision, in discipline, in the mechanical reliability of German engineering. Yet what I witnessed that morning defied all three. Rumors spread through the camp in the following days that the Americans were using a new kind of radio, one that didn't crackle under artillery fire, one that ignored the chaos of electricity. I remember the name being whispered among the technicians. Galvin Manufacturing Company, a civilian firm from Chicago that the Americans now called Motorola. They said its engineers had perfected a technology developed by a man named Edwin Armstrong, frequency-modulation. I didn't know what that meant, only that it allowed them to speak through the thunder of engines as calmly as men at a cafe. Someone passed around a captured schematic, explaining that their radio, the SCR-508, transmitted at 25 watts, twice the power of our FuG-5, and operated between 20.0 and 27.9 MHz with 10 preset crystal channels, so stable they drifted less than 0.01%. I tried to imagine such precision inside a tank, bouncing over rocks and sand, its circuits surviving heat and vibration. Ours couldn't even hold a signal when we sneezed. When I lay down that night, the tinnitus in my ears merged with the memory of that clean American voice crackling through static. I didn't understand how they did it, but I knew what it meant. While we shouted into dead air, they were talking to each other through the storm, as if the battlefield itself had become their command room. Italy, September 1943. The mountains rose like walls of stone and fog, swallowing every sound. Our Panzer IVs crawled up narrow roads carved into cliffs above the valleys near Cassino. The air smelled of rain and diesel. Inside the turret, I could barely hear my driver over the constant echo of our own engine. When I keyed the transmitter, the FuG 5 hissed back at me, then went dead. The signal couldn't climb over the ridgelines. Each reflection from the rock bounced the amplitude modulation back against itself until the words dissolved into static. The technicians called it multipath interference. To us, it meant silence. We went back to old habits, hand signals from hatches, colored flares in the dark, couriers riding through mud with written orders that were already obsolete by the time they arrived. Communication had turned primitive again, and with it, our tactics. The fog thickened and the valleys below filled with thunder, the sound of American artillery and engines. Through binoculars, I saw Shermans moving in formation across the slopes. They advanced where radios should have died, tanks separated by ridges yet changing direction as one. My gunner muttered, "Impossible! How can they talk in that terrain?" I had no answer. Later that night, around a campfire, one of our signalmen shared a rumor. The Americans used a system called SCR 508, a radio immune to echo and interference. "It's the same frequency modulation they tested in Africa," he said. "They can talk through mountains." We laughed at the absurdity, but I remembered the voice I'd heard in Tunisia, clear as glass, and stopped laughing first. A few days later, during a skirmish near the Rapido River, we lost contact with battalion command for nearly an hour. Our platoon attacked the wrong hillside. The Shermans were already waiting. They opened fire with uncanny coordination, as if they could hear every move we made. That night I wrote in my notebook, "We communicate with flags. They communicate with waves." The difference was more than technology. It was the measure of two armies, one speaking in light, the other in silence. Normandy, July 1944. The hedgerows turned the countryside into a green labyrinth of death. Every field was a fortress, every ditch a trap. Visibility was 50, maybe 100 meters at most. Our tanks crawled forward through narrow gaps in the earth walls, the air thick with humidity and the smell of crushed leaves. Communication was nearly impossible. Inside the Panzer IV, my voice came back to me as an echo inside the steel hull. The FuG 5 sputtered with the same useless static, every burst of the engine killing what little signal we had. Orders took minutes to pass. By the time they reached the next tank, the situation had already changed. We were fighting blind, separated by walls of soil and hedges dense as armor. And yet, the Americans moved through this maze like men guided by unseen hands. Their Shermans advanced in coordination with infantry that never seemed to lose contact. Through captured reports, we learned how they had welded field telephones, EE-8 units, onto the rear plates of their tanks, connected by wire straight into the BC-606 intercom inside. Infantry could pick up the handset, speak directly to the crew, and the commander could relay the message instantly through the tank's SCR 508 radio. It was absurdly simple and devastatingly effective. Our intelligence noted the technical gap too late. Infantry radios like the SCR 300 operated on 40.0 to 48.00 MHz, while tank radios used 20.0 to 27.9 MHz. Two systems that should have been incompatible, joined together by a single wire and a soldier's voice. When I first heard the story, I felt a chill that no battlefield ever gave me. We were engineers, men who prided ourselves on precision, on systems and doctrines, but the Americans had solved their problem with nothing more than a field telephone and improvisation. During one engagement near St. Lo, we ambushed a Sherman column. But within seconds, artillery fell on our position, called in by infantry who had simply lifted a receiver and spoken into the tank behind them. That was when I realized the truth. They had turned a wire into a weapon. Every hedge, every trench, every squad was part of the same network. I wrote that night, "We are losing not because they have more tanks, but because they have fewer silences. They fill every gap, every breath, every pause with connection." In those tangled fields of Normandy, I finally understood. We were fighting an army that had erased the sound of isolation. July 25th, 1944, Operation Cobra. The rain had stopped, and the air above Normandy trembled with the roar of bombers. The American offensive began with a storm of fire so dense the horizon itself seemed to melt. I was stationed with what was left of the Panzerlehr Division, facing the U.S. 2nd Armored Division under Major General Edward H. Brooks. We were told to expect chaos from their attack, confusion, scattered coordination, broken command. Instead, what I saw defied every expectation of warfare. More than 200 Sherman tanks moved across the open fields with uncanny precision, their formations shifting as if conducted by a single hand. Each time we tried to outflank them, their columns adjusted instantly, one unit covering another in movements too synchronized to be coincidence. Artillery followed their calls within minutes, shells landing with mechanical accuracy. Our observers clocked the delay. Between an American tank's request and the first shell's impact, 3 to 5 minutes. For us, even when our FuG 5 radios worked, it took 15 to 30 minutes to get artillery on target, assuming the message wasn't lost in static. Their radio network functioned like a nervous system. Orders pulsed from headquarters to tanks, to infantry, to artillery batteries, all through frequency modulation. FM. 25 watts of clean power cut through engine noise and distance like it was nothing. Meanwhile, our 10-watt amplitude modulation, distorted by every spark and vibration, barely reached half a mile when moving. In theory, our signal range was 1 mile stationary, but in the reality of battle, it felt shorter than a man's shout. From my command hatch, I watched through binoculars as an American tank column advanced past burning hedgerows. Each Sherman moved as if aware of its neighbors, spacing perfect, timing exact. I shouted to my radio operator to call flank support. Silence. The FuG 5 was alive, its lights flickering, but all I heard was the familiar hiss of defeat. When their artillery hit, it wasn't random. They struck our routes of retreat, our supply trucks, our wounded. They weren't guessing. Someone was telling them, instantly. Later, we captured fragments of a destroyed Sherman's equipment, SCR 508, the same model I had heard about months earlier in Italy. 20 to 27.9 megahertz, 10 preset channels, crystal-controlled stability at plus or minus 0.01%. It wasn't a radio, it was a weapon system. That night, as we withdrew under moonlight, I finally understood what we were facing. Each Sherman was more than a tank. It was a node, one eye in a hunting pack connected by invisible sine waves. We fought individual duels of steel. They fought as an organism of metal and sound. Watching their formation glide across the fields, I realized something chilling. They didn't need to see each other to move as one. They already did. The battlefield was their conversation, and every explosion was part of their dialogue. September 1944, Aracourt. The rain never stopped that week, turning the fields of Lorraine into a swamp that swallowed treads and hope alike. Our new Panther tanks had just arrived, sleek, powerful, armed with the 75mm KWK 42 L70 gun. Its range and accuracy far superior to any Sherman we had faced before. On paper, we were invincible. In reality, we were deaf. Opposite us stood the U.S. 4th Armored Division, their columns hidden by fog and coordination that bordered on sorcery. When the first exchange began, our optics spotted movement, Shermans darting between patches of mist, not by sight, but by signal. We fired first, confident in our superior range, but their response came faster than thought. Within minutes, artillery shells fell precisely on our position. I screamed into the microphone, "Battery support! Grid 224! Static answered me, sharp and endless. The FuG 5 flickered. My words dissolved into noise. I switched frequencies, tapped the casing, shouted orders to nearby tanks, but their engines drowned everything. One by one, I saw our Panthers burning, machines that should have ruled the battlefield, silent, blind, alone. Later, I learned that the Americans had used over 200 Sherman tanks linked by radio networks that allowed them to track our movements in real time. When one tank spotted us, it spoke to all of them. Artillery arrived within 5 minutes. Air support followed. We, with our powerful guns and thick armor, took 15 to 30 minutes to coordinate a single strike, if the message even reached command. The difference was fatal. During one desperate engagement, I remember hammering the transmit key so hard, my glove tore. "Do you hear me?" I shouted, but the only answer was a hiss that rose and fell with the static of our dying system. The sound of that silence has never left me. When the smoke cleared after days of fighting, 281 German armored vehicles lay wrecked across the countryside. The Americans had lost only 41 Shermans, a kill ratio of 7 to 1, but the numbers tell only part of it. We didn't lose because their tanks were stronger. We lost because they heard each other, and we did not. They fought as a chorus. We fought as solos drowned out by our own noise. That night, I sat in the wreck of my Panther, rain tapping on the armor like Morse code from another world. I wrote one sentence in my notebook before sleep took me. Death does not always come from shells, it comes from silence. And in our court, silence was the loudest thing I had ever heard. March 1945. Remagen. The Rhine shimmered under gray clouds, swollen with rain and retreat. We had been told the Americans would find no bridges intact, yet that morning, scouts brought impossible news. The Ludendorff Bridge still stood. By the time we grasped what it meant, the U.S. 9th Armored Division had already crossed. Later, we learned how quickly it happened. A single tank commander spotted the structure, radioed his find, and within minutes, the report reached 1st Army headquarters. In less than an hour, the entire American front pivoted toward Remagen. It was coordination on a scale we could barely imagine. For us, communication still traveled through fragile field telephone lines, stretched across mud and ruins, exposed to every bombing run. Each time a wire snapped, whole battalions vanished into silence. We waited for replacement lines, for couriers on motorcycles weaving through artillery fire, for messages already obsolete when they arrived. By the time orders to destroy the bridge reached our engineers, it was too late. American tanks and infantry were already across, their radio nets alive with constant chatter. I remember standing on a ridge, binoculars in hand, watching as their columns expanded around the bridgehead like ripples in water. Whenever one unit stalled, another flowed in to fill the gap. I could hear their coordination through intercepted frequencies, calm voices, clipped and precise, directing armor, infantry, and artillery as though choreographed. Around me, our counterattack stumbled in fragments. One company advanced without cover, unaware the neighboring unit had been destroyed. Another waited for permission that never came, its phone lines cut by bombing. Overhead, American aircraft roamed freely, guided by radio-equipped controllers on the ground. Within hours, our attempt to retake the bridge collapsed into chaos, not from lack of courage, but from the absence of connection. I shouted for updates, but my words died in the static of a broken transmitter. The only messages that reached me came through sound, the whine of aircraft, the rattle of machine guns, the thunder of artillery marking every failed advance. That evening, as the bridge behind us still stood under enemy hands, I understood the true disaster. We hadn't simply lost a crossing, we had lost the conversation of war itself. Watching the Americans build pontoons beside the Ludendorff, their radios alive with confidence, I whispered to myself, "We did not lose the bridge, we lost the airwaves." April 1945, the Ruhr Pocket. The war was ending, but no one dared to say it aloud. Over 325,000 German soldiers were trapped, pressed against the Rhine by American armies closing from every direction. Our radios hissed with emptiness. Command posts vanished into static. Field units fought in isolation, each convinced they were the last still holding. I remember the final transmission from Field Marshal Walter Model before his line went silent. No contact with adjacent units. No contact with higher headquarters. Those words captured everything. The army that had once marched across Europe now spoke to no one. We fought surrounded not just by enemies, but by silence. I tried to raise neighboring battalions, even local artillery. but every channel returned the same faint hum of defeat. When the encirclement finally collapsed, I surrendered with what was left of my company. Weeks later, sitting in a prisoner camp, I read an American technical report that explained what the battlefield had already taught me. They had produced over 50,000 radio sets, SCR 508, SCR 528, SCR 538, enough to equip every one of their 49 324 Sherman tanks, a deployment rate of 100%. Each transmitted at 25 watts, stable within current 0.01%, with a range of 7 to 10 miles in motion. By contrast, we had built roughly 6,000 FuG 5 transceivers for 12,000 armored vehicles, only 20% equipped, 10 watts of unstable amplitude modulation, drifting +61%, and barely reaching half a mile when moving. Reading those numbers, I felt no anger, only understanding. We had poured genius into armor, steel, and guns, yet neglected the invisible thread that tied it all together. The Americans built more than tanks. They built a system, an army that could hear itself think. Looking back, I wrote one line in the margin of that report. We built machines. They built a network. And in that difference lay the story of our defeat. I often think about the weight of things. Our FuG 5 radios weighed barely 10 kilograms, but carried only silence. The American SCR 508, at 181 pounds, carried the voices of an entire army. We believe mass and armor won wars. They believed communication did. Years later, I read a remark attributed to Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel. We knew how to build tanks. They knew how to make them work together. Whether he said it or not, it was true. We built machines that fought alone. They built machines that could talk. And in that difference lay the story of the 20th century. When I close my eyes, I can still hear the faint hiss of the FuG 5, the static that once filled my world. It fades, replaced by a clarity I never knew in battle. As if across time, I can finally hear the voices we missed. In modern war, armor means nothing without the signal that binds it. Information is stronger than steel. Connection is survival. Somewhere beyond that silence, in the hum of unseen frequencies, I imagine the ghosts of our tanks still trying to speak, and, at last, being heard.